Can Turkey's war against the Kurdistan Workers Party, the PKK, ever end? On the 23rd of October 2024, armed insurgents attacked a Turkish defence company, leaving at least 5 dead and more than 20 injured. Although no one claimed responsibility for the attack, the Turkish government immediately blamed the PKK, launching airstrikes against the group's bases in Syria and northern Iraq. All this has again highlighted just how much this 40-year-old conflict continues to dominate Turkish security. But what exactly is the issue all about? And can it ever be resolved? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. Around the world, many countries face armed uprisings aimed at overthrowing the ruling administration or opening the way for ethnic autonomy or even independence. But while many insurgencies remain low-level and short-lived, some become a serious and sustained challenge to state security. In addition to undermining internal stability, they can also profoundly affect a country's external relations, often spilling over into neighbouring states and becoming a source of friction on the international stage. One of the best examples in modern international relations is the case of the PKK in Turkey. For over 40 years, the Kurdistan Workers Party has been fighting an armed campaign against the Turkish state. But despite efforts to try to resolve the conflict, the insurgency continues to pose a serious security challenge to the country. Often described as the world's largest nation without a state, the Kurds speak an Indo-European language that's related to Persian and predominantly follow the Sunni branch of the Islamic faith. While estimates vary, it's believed that they number around 30 to 35 million. While they're spread across several countries such as Iraq, Iran, Syria and Armenia, and there's now a large diaspora community around the world, the largest Kurdish community is found in Turkey. Numbering around 15 to 20 million, they make up between 10 and 20% of the Turkish population. While the Kurds have a long history stretching back thousands of years, they came under Ottoman Turkish rule in the 13th century. This lasted until the end of the First World War. Under the terms of the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, the Anatolian Peninsula, the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, would be divided. As well as a Turkish state, parts would be given to Greece, France and Armenia. In addition, the Kurds would be allowed to hold an independence referendum. However, the treaty never came into force. As the new Republic of Turkey emerged in 1924, Kurdish hopes for their own state disappeared. Instead, they were left scattered across Turkey, Iraq, Syria and Iran. While there were significant Kurdish uprisings in both Iran and Iraq in the decades that followed, for the most part the situation remained relatively quiet in Turkey. However, below the surface, tensions were rising, fed mainly by Turkey's refusal to accept the existence of a separate Kurdish identity within the country. These problems began to surface in the 1970s. As widespread political violence swept across Turkey, a radical left-wing Kurdish nationalist group emerged, the Kurdistan Workers Party, or PKK. Led by Abdullah Ocalan, it called for the creation of an independent Kurdish state carved out of southeast Turkey. Although the group staged low-level attacks in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in 1984 it launched a full-scale armed uprising against Turkish rule. At first, this was focused on the rural areas of the southeast. However, by the end of the decade, the conflict had escalated dramatically. As well as fighting an ever-expanding guerrilla campaign against Turkish armed forces in the countryside, the PKK had also started attacking regional towns and cities across the southeast. From there, it steadily expanded its reach, carrying out bombings and shootings in Istanbul and the country's capital, Ankara. By the start of the 1990s, the conflict was taking an increasingly high toll. In addition to the tens of thousands who'd been killed or wounded, growing numbers of Kurds and Turks had been forced to flee from the fighting in the southeast, often moving to cities elsewhere in the country. Meanwhile, the PKK was steadily gaining strength, establishing camps in the Kurdish-dominated areas of northern Iraq. On top of this, the PKK insurgency was also becoming a source of tension with neighbouring Syria, where Abdullah Ocalan was now living. This all came to a head in 1988 as Turkey threatened to invade Syria unless the Syrian government handed over the PKK leader. But rather than give him up, the Syrian government instead expelled him. From there, Ocalan travelled first to Russia, then Italy, and then Greece, before ending up at the Greek embassy in Kenya. On the 15th of February 1999, Turkish special forces arrested him as he left the embassy compound for yet another destination. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please do consider giving it a like and perhaps subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. It all really helps. Thanks so much, and now back to the video. Ocalan's arrest was a massive victory for the Turkish government and opened a new phase in the conflict. While the PKK leader was initially sentenced to death for armed secession and leading a terrorist group, the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Meanwhile, a PKK ceasefire raised hopes for a political settlement. This optimism further increased in late 2002 when a new government took power in Turkey under the Justice and Development Party led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Seen as a radical break from the highly militarised secular establishment that had taken a very restrictive view of Turkish identity in the past, the AKP administration began to ease many of the long-standing and widely despised restrictions on Kurdish identity. This included ending the ban on Kurdish language names, permitting media broadcasts in Kurdish, and even allowing Kurdish private language schools to open. But despite hopes that this would all pave the way for a breakthrough, the initial signs of progress in the end proved to be short-lived. While the PKK believed that the AKP was insincere about peace, the Turkish government saw the PKK's demands as excessive, even though the group had by now given up on calls for independence and was instead focused on regional self-rule. As mistrust intensified, pressure grew from hardliners to abandon the political process and return to military action. And in June 2004, the PKK ended its ceasefire. The end of the ceasefire would quickly see a return to intense fighting. As the PKK restarted its attacks, the Turkish military stepped up its operations against the groups, launching ground and air strikes against PKK targets in Turkey and northern Iraq. All this would see thousands more killed, wounded and displaced. While the Turkish government initially attempted to address the issue by introducing further limited reforms, by the end of the decade it was increasingly evident that a new political process was needed. Likewise, the PKK, now weakened by years of fighting Turkish forces, also began to accept the case for new talks. In 2012, negotiations began between Ocalan and the Turkish government. While these were initially held in secret using a go-between, by the following year the process had been publicly acknowledged. But while the talks led to further progress in various areas, including greater cultural rights and steps to decentralise power, by 2015 the negotiations were unravelling as the government refused to consider PKK calls for full Kurdish autonomy in the southeast and the release of their leader. To add to all this, tensions were further fed by developments in neighbouring Syria, where the civil war had seen the emergence of a Kurdish autonomous region under the YPG, which was closely affiliated with the PKK, a development that many in Turkey felt would further cement PKK calls for regional self-rule. All this would come to a head in July 2015 when a bomb attack killed over 30 young Turkish aid workers who were about to head to Syria. Accusing the Turkish government of being behind the attack, the PKK then killed 2 Turkish policemen. As Turkish forces retaliated, bombing PKK camps in northern Iraq, the ceasefire collapsed. Once again, the end of peace talks led to a rapid escalation of violence. At first, this was centred on the towns and cities in the southeast, many of which became no-go zones for the Turkish security forces as local groups set up barricades. But while the Turkish military and police were eventually able to retake control, imposing highly restrictive measures to maintain peace and security, the conflict continued, becoming increasingly focused on PKK bases in Syria and Iraq. Indeed, this even saw Turkey launch a ground invasion of northern Syria in 2019. However, while the cross-border conflict has tended to be the centre of attention in recent years, and the scale and intensity of attacks in Turkey have dropped, the threat from the PKK remains an ongoing concern. This was highlighted by a bomb attack in Istanbul in November 2022 that Ankara attributed to the PKK-affiliated YPG. This was also followed by another bombing of a government building in Ankara in October 2023 that the PKK directly claimed responsibility for. And it's this ongoing threat that was most recently highlighted on the 23rd of October when at least 2 people launched a deadly attack against the Turkish aerospace company. While the precise details of the attack remain unclear, the Turkish government immediately blamed the PKK, launching airstrikes on PKK bases in Iraq and Syria. So, as the PKK insurgency now enters its 5th decade, can the conflict ever be resolved? As things stand, it seems difficult to see a resumption of talks, although there have been some promising signs recently that the Turkish government is looking at the possibility of resumed negotiations. For a start, there's still no suggestion that either side is willing to ease up on their fundamental positions. The Turkish government is unwilling to grant the extensive political rights that many Kurds want. Aside from the deep mistrust that exists after decades of conflict, many in Turkey see any offer of greater cultural rights, let alone regional self-rule, as a fundamental threat to Turkish territorial integrity. On top of this, the legacy of violence has left many suspicious, if not openly opposed, to entering into negotiations with the PKK. This also makes releasing Ocalan, a PKK demand, difficult to accept. Then again, just days before the attack, a nationalist leader in Turkey suggested that Ocalan might in fact be eligible for parole if the PKK was willing to lay down its arms and disband as an organisation. Likewise, the PKK also bears a burden of blame for the impasse. Despite shifting its position from independence to regional autonomy, it's been unable to renounce violence. Although some might argue that this can't be done for as long as Turkey opposes any steps to address the group's political demands, peace processes often need to start with a leap of faith. While some in the PKK appear to understand this, hardline elements refuse to give up the armed struggle. To add to all this, the situation is also complicated by broader regional factors, not least of all the strength of the PKK-affiliated YPG in northern Syria, which Turkey views as a fundamental threat, as well as the continued presence of PKK camps in northern Iraq. Ultimately, therefore, any resolution will not only require both sides to want to return to the table, but also be willing to give ground on crucial issues. The PKK would have to offer sincere indications that it was willing to give up its armed struggle once and for all. Meanwhile, the Turkish government would also need to signal a genuine commitment to significant political reform, leading to greater Kurdish rights as well as a degree of autonomy in the southeast. However, none of this seems likely at this stage. Instead, as the latest attack and the official Turkish response shows, the chances for an end to Turkey's 40-year Kurdish insurgency seem to remain as remote as ever. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.